Hello and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. Today we're going to take a look at ancient Greece and how their art developed. We'll be looking mostly at ancient Greece because they had a lot of development in a lot of different ways. We're going to have to come back to them at another time, but this is going to be a really great primer for a lot of information. We're going to start off with a look at what they thought about art and what they thought about beauty, and this is going to be a much more heavy episode than the last. The last episode was just sort of setting up the structure for how the next part in this series will look. So today we're getting to the real good stuff here. We're going to begin this with a look at aesthetics and beauty. So aesthetics is the discipline aimed at the study of beauty and art. Aesthetics is a discipline in that it is not a science. This is not an objective thing that can be looked at with a criteria that we say these are true and these are false. This is subjective, but at the same time, subjective doesn't always mean individually subjective. At various points in time, there have been multiple schools and multiple concepts of what is aesthetic and what is not, and most of the time people sort of tend to group together on these concepts and to move in large subjective spheres. So what can be aesthetic or pleasing at one time can slightly change, but honestly, through most of art, aesthetics have been more refined than repositioned. Aesthetic art is usually obvious. It's what makes it aesthetic that is so interesting. So when you look at something, you can usually tell if you enjoy looking at it or if you want to continue to look at it, but it's not always clear exactly why you feel that way. It's important to be able to understand what pulls you to something and why you enjoy a particular piece of art, because the elements that make up that work of art actually say a lot about the artist, the message, and what's trying to be conveyed there. So aesthetics began as a movement to understand something that people saw and observed and wanted to know more about. There was a lot of different concepts in philosophy and metaphysics that were being thought about at this time, and aesthetics was just sort of one of those concepts. In ancient times, aesthetics was seen more as a tool. Plato himself said a lot about aesthetics only being important when a proper idea is being put forth or when something that he likes is being put out, then it's aesthetic. But it became a more refined concept and a more well thought out concept as time rolled on and as the ancient Greeks started to strike out in their Polis all across the Mediterranean. So let's briefly talk about aesthetics over time, at least up until the ancient Greek period, just so that we know what we're talking about in context. Ancient aesthetics, dating back to the Bronze Age and beyond that, were much more about conveying ideas and knowledge than about actual technical accuracy. What I mean by this is the aesthetics of ancient Egypt were certainly there. The eyes, the feet, the body, the concepts that they use, they all exist for a reason, but they weren't particularly effective at portraying real life. This may not have been the object of what their artists were trying to do. After all, artists in ancient Egypt were much less free to practice the way that they wanted to than artists from future times when they weren't directly responsible to their priest classes. But the art of their time had an aesthetic that actually had a very large impact on a lot of areas. As Egypt began to wane and the Persian Empire stepped in and others, they would produce sculpture and works of art very similar to the Egyptian style. This was good and bad. The Egyptians certainly had refined art from further than it was before them. However, they had stopped at a certain point. Their art was no longer about conveying reality or trying to get a true message across. It became more political, and it became more about showing the pharaoh and his side as big and strong. Their sculpture was supposed to show power and be sort of intimidating, honestly. Their aesthetic jumped less from representing true pictures of life to a more representing what the people controlling the art wanted things to look like. This led to a sort of stagnation in their art, in that they reached a certain level and never really came to surpass it. Their aesthetic was entrenched in much of the region, and even in ancient Greece and Persia and other areas around the Mediterranean, we see very similar styles, and they were picked up for various reasons. Stone is heavy, and it's hard to make intimate, realistic pictures with it, and it's much easier to make something like a column or something that stands straight up. So rather than trying to experiment with this property, they just decided it was good enough on its own, and to allow the image to conform to the medium rather than the medium conforming to the image. When the study of beauty and the discipleship of aesthetic arose in ancient Greece, something very interesting happened. These people were no longer attempting to create stories for the people who were in control of their lives. Now they were in independent cities, struggling for cultural dominance, to make a name for themselves, and for the sake of what we'll call art for now. As we'll see in a little bit, art has gone through a big transformation since the ancient Greek times. The concept of fine art comes a little bit later, but back in ancient Greek times, they would have called this techne. We'll define that in a little bit. And the need for innovation and experimentation, which arose from the nature of the polis, was quickly adopted by the artists themselves. If you want to know a little bit more about ancient Greece and the polis and why this society would lead to innovation and experimentation, make sure to go check out the video I did on ancient Greece and the polis. It'll help clarify this a bit. But the main point here is that the freedom allowed in the disparate polis of the Mediterranean gave a new, fresh breath into the old art style. So while they carried over much of the Egyptian tradition, especially in their sculpture, they would soon come to far surpass it. So I posed this question a while ago on this channel. What is art? As I've said, I don't believe it's my responsibility or anyone else's to tell you what your definition of art is, but more to give you tools that you can use to write that definition yourself. So I want to take a look at how the ancient Greeks might have answered this question. What is art? It's important to know that a lot of concepts that we have today weren't available back then. For instance, the term fine art today, which refers to painting, sculpture, architecture, music, poetry, and performance art, didn't really exist. There was no umbrella term lumping all of these ideas together. Some people like Plato and Aristotle did manage to link them together in different ways, but they were never put under an umbrella like they are today. There was no real word art in ancient Greek, the way that we have the word art today. A lot of the times when we say art, what we mean is more discipline or skill, the art of crafting or the art of producing or creating. So they did have similar concepts, and I want to go over what they would have seen art as and how they would be able to interpret it aesthetically. So the first word that we really need to know when we talk about ancient Greek art is techne. Techne is essentially the refining of a skill to a point of expertise. It's the closest word in ancient Greek to art today. The concept is a little bit different. Essentially, techne is a sort of pride in the work that you do, dedication, and responsibility for innovation and improvement. Someone who does something that doesn't work very well for 30 years doesn't really have the same amount of techne as someone who has started something within the past few years but has rapidly improved and created new ideas. This sort of goes along the idea of everything is art, in that anything that is produced with techne could have been art back then. The only thing being, if you weren't very good at something and didn't really care about that, then you wouldn't have had techne, and what you produced wouldn't have been considered art. Again, this is highly subjective, and different people argued very different things. Plato argued that ideas that supported what he thought made a good society had techne and therefore were art, whereas Aristotle took a much looser view. He wrote a really great book called Poetics, you should read it if you get the chance, that looked at what art was and how it tried to react. And Aristotle brought in this newer idea that went hand in hand with techne called mimesis. Now, mimesis is a little more complicated. The simplest way I could put it is mimesis is a likeness, such as a picture, a sculpture, something like that, to a subject, such as a person, whatever you're trying to capture in your art, that has as close a reaction as the subject itself. So, if you make a statue of a person and they both look exactly the same, they're both standing the same way, they both look sort of real, and you don't think you could get a lot closer to an exact likeness, that is mimesis. So techne being sort of technical skill and refined ability, and mimesis being a likeness that evokes a similar reaction. That's the important part. Mimesis was not simply imitation. If it was, then you could make something that didn't look exactly right, but felt right. Mimesis had to have a reaction attached to it. You needed to feel the same way looking at this statue as you did looking at the real thing. So with these two concepts, techne and mimesis, the ancient Greeks could have looked at different works, looked at the skill and the craftsmanship that went in, and felt how looking at that would have compared to looking at the real thing. And this would have given them their glimpse on what was aesthetic and what was art. So, what was aesthetic in ancient Greece? Let's give a couple examples before we start going into things in a little more detail. I just want to make sure that I properly explain these concepts of techne and mimesis. They are common threads that run through a lot of history and could actually have a lot to say about how we look at things today. They're very important concepts, and I want to make sure that I give them the amount of time that they duly deserve. So let's take a little bit closer look at techne in the context of ancient Greece. Techne could be sculpture, could be saddle making, it could be the way you farm, the way you paint. When we look at techne, it's not that you look at their work and you look at their painting and you say that is a work of techne. The techne is a proof, essentially. Techne was the refinement that you put into your activity, into your craft, into your work. It was a quality that you possessed personally and that couldn't be taken away from you. The techne was not the finished product. The the finished product was an arrow pointing towards the creator. This is a very different concept, especially when you compare art from today, where the finished art is standalone from the creator. It's a little bit of an interesting concept because when we call someone an artist today, we call someone who has produced great works of art an artist. Back then, you wouldn't have called them the same thing because techne could be possessed by just about anyone who had a practice skill. So it was much more a quality of being than it was a title or a notable way to call yourself. A person possessing techne was very skilled and usually an innovator. This meant that ancient Greek art, especially what we call fine art today, the sculpture, the painting, the architecture, was much more expensive in time and in money. This is because they had very different and very specific goals that they were attempting to achieve. When they built their pillars for their great temples, they didn't actually build them in straight lines. They knew that the human eye is round, so you perceive straight lines with a slight curvature. Therefore, they curved the pillars just enough to look like straight lines. So, this is another area where we can talk about mimesis. It's not a straight line, even though you look at it and it appears to be. You look at it, it appears to be a straight line, it gives you the feeling that you're looking at something that is a straight pillar. You're actually not in reality. This is another great example of why mimesis is not necessarily imitation, but more an imparting of a feeling. So both techne and mimesis are quite different concepts from ideas that we have today. Techne would have been a feeling that you had and that gave you the ability to improve on your craft and your work, and mimesis would have been the proof that your techne had worked and transferred the feelings of reality through a medium to your audience. This categorization of art is very simple, and I think it's two very good tools for looking at art in any period. It's very important when you look at a piece to not only look at it for what it is, but to look at it for what it could be, to look at other art pieces from a similar time. If it's very different and has a lot of new ideas, that work came from a person with great techne. If when looking at it, rather than looking at a sheet of canvas with some oil and some pigments thrown on it, you feel and you respond to it, that's a work of great mimesis. These two ideas, techne and mimesis, helped shape what was Greek art and would have been their answer to what proper aesthetic was.